I don't think I set out to answer a question so much as to make a case. I had increasingly come to the conclusion that most of the literature about the voluntary sector, the way in which policymakers and infrastructure organizations dealt with it, was based on a misapprehension of what the voluntary sector really was. So I set out to try to correct that. Well, the first argument, I think, was that the common view of it concentrates on a small minority of voluntary organizations and ignores the vast majority. Now, that would be the first thing, I think. I think, secondly, those that are given this attention tend to be at severe risk of losing their independence from the state. And secondly, I think or thirdly, whichever it is, I think they're also deeply influenced by the market. So, but on both those counts, they are no longer very clearly part of what was seen to be a distinctive sector called the voluntary sector. The final point, I think, is that both state and private sector organizations are built on the basis of bureaucracy. And increasingly, voluntary organizations over the time I've known them have become extremely bureaucratic. And I don't think that is how voluntary organizations started out and what they wanted to be. In the UK, we had the voluntary sector. That was the term. Before then, people talked about voluntary action as a sphere of activity. The idea of a sector, as I said, came around from about the 1978 and the Wolfenden Committee. And subsequently, I was involved with an organization of academics, which also led to the foundation of a journal. And we were clear that the term we wanted to use was voluntary sector. And that was clearly, there's a very clear understanding what voluntary meant in that capacity. It did not mean volunteering. It meant that whereas the public sector organizations are controlled by and responsible to the state, and private sector organizations depend on profit for their operation. Voluntary organizations, voluntary in the sense that there's no reason why they should be there, except a group of people decided that they ought to be, and set them up. So the voluntary is that ability to make a choice about what you're going to do about whatever problem it is you're addressing. So I've always preferred that. I'm now, for reasons might come on to later, getting increasingly unhappy about the term sector. The voluntary I stay with. Non-profit, I think, is very much based on the American. I think the dominant paradigm is that a voluntary organization is made up of paid staff. The organization works because it has paid staff. It will have a body of volunteers who are the trustees or the board, allegedly governing it. But the motor force is the staff, and increasingly the staff is headed by somebody who's called a chief executive, who has similar authority within the organization to a private sector company. And a lot of the authority of the organization is vested in that person rather than in the people who set it up in the first place, who would be now called the board. So I think that's one. Where there are unpaid people working in the organization, they tend to be treated as fairly menial people, given jobs to do and controlled by the paid staff, who are responsible for deciding what they do, how they do it, and whether they do it well enough. So I think that's right. The other part of it is that increasingly the point of those organizations is to deliver services, usually it's seen through the prism of some sort of social welfare in the broadest sense. So that's broadly speaking how, a bit of a caricature, but that's how the dominant paradigm plays itself out, I think. The first is that the control ought to be vested in the people who own the place, rather than the people who are paid to work in it. In other words, real control should be in the hands of the board, or whatever you like to call them, the governing body. And that governing body should have its roots in a significant constituency of people who want that organisation to exist and to prosper. So that the staff are a means to an end and not the end in the way that the board should be. So I think that's the first and main point. I think the second point is that it should be fairly clear that the organisation will see itself as quite distinct from what the state is happening in that area. And thirdly, I think it would have, it would not be, what's the word? It would not be simply bureaucratic. It would have elements of bureaucracy, because if you have paid staff, you have to have elements of bureaucracy, but it wouldn't be simple bureaucratic organisation. For example, in a bureaucratic organisation, you have a job, you have limits on what you can do in that job, limits on the authority you have, limits on the range of tasks you can carry out. Now, I think with my idea of voluntary organisation was that there's a great deal of flexibility in both those dimensions, and it is not a simple you do as you're told, and you don't. You shouldn't be able to get away with somebody should not be allowed to get away with saying that's not part of your job description, you shouldn't be doing it. If it really needs to be done, then it's worth doing. What the distinction I'd make between kinds of organisation is more to do with what I call associations and what are called voluntary agencies. Now, voluntary agencies are the kind of things we've been talking about. They involve paid staff. They may involve volunteers as well. Associations are purely voluntary bodies. So that's it. An association is a bunch of people who've drawn a boundary around themselves, given themselves a name, a few rules about how they're going to conduct themselves. So they may decide they're going to have a chair and a secretary and that sort of thing, with a great deal of flexibility about who does what and how things are done. And they respond to who does what and how things are done, essentially to where the people for whom they have set up this association exist and have needs to be met. And those may be just the members of the organisation, or the members of the organisation, other people like them. So if for example, you set up an association because you're concerned about the welfare of blind people, you would have a good number of blind people as part of your membership, but it doesn't mean you would then exclude other blind people from getting the benefits of what you do. You'd see them as part of the same constituency. So I think that gives you the area in which the impulse from below is coming up. I think the impulse from above is very much more to do with either what is where the organization now is responding to signals from government and to signals from the private sector. So they're responding to signals from government because that's where the money's coming from, essentially. See, I remember when I started out in the sector, if you you had an idea about some kind of service you wanted to provide and you needed money, you could go to one local authority or to the national body and you could say, we got a great idea here. We think there is a need for this kind of thing, and we think this is the way in which it can be dealt with. And we don't think you're providing it. And we want you to give us some money to enable us to do that, because we think it's a good thing. Now that very simply was the model. Now it doesn't work like that. Now the state comes to you as a voluntary organization and says, we want to do some work on such and such, and we want you to do some of the work, and we will tell you who you're going to do it for. We tell you how you're going to do it, how you're going to measure it, and how you're going to report to me that you've done it. And by the way, there's other people want this, so there's a competition to see how, if you can prove you're the best value for money, you get it. Now that is a recipe for top-down domination. Everything is being laid down from above, whereas before it was some sort of exchange or negotiation. I think there's a fundamental tension, it seems to me, between what government wants and what a voluntary sector organisation should want. Now they both want to have services delivered to whoever they're delivering services to, but the government wants it very clearly laid down exactly what the service is going to be, who's entitled to get it, all those sorts of things. And I think the voluntary sector organisation, built into its genes, is the idea that actually you need to be more responsive to the individual recipient, and giving them giving them everybody exactly the same, it's not necessarily the best way of dealing with the matter. So I think there's a fundamental sort of difference there. It's interesting too that as government became closer to the sector through contracting, in other ways, there's a sort of paradox. If you read the government papers of all the time, the argument is that we want the voluntary sector to do things rather than government to do it, because they will be more flexible, i.e. less bureaucratic, more responsive, i.e. less bureaucratic, and more innovative, which may or may not mean less bureaucratic. And that's the logic of having the voluntary sector do things rather than the state, because they have those advantages. What in fact happens is once you get into contracts, then you tie them so tight that there's no room for any of those things to happen effectively inside the voluntary organisation. That's one of the serious problems there. One example was in the field of homelessness. The idea of that was that the major voluntary organisations involved in the homelessness field were arranging hostel and other kinds of accommodation to meet the needs of people who are otherwise homeless. But because the money was coming from the government, they were increasingly being told by the government exactly who should be admitted to the hostel, what rules should be govern it, and so on and so forth. And so that you had a number of different voluntary organizations, but they might as well just have been the same, because they were being given a very prescribed set of tasks by the government. Now, alongside that, there were still a few largely church-based small organizations who had managed to scrape some money together locally, and they were providing shelters for homeless people, but in a very different way. They, with very much less in the way of rules and regulations about how things were. If they thought somebody was in need, they would try to help them, and they would try to help them in the way which the people who wanted help thought was appropriate, rather than what the government told them they should do. So that, I mean, that's a concrete example of one of the ways in which it was happening. And that was well, it's increasingly the case. I mean, another example, I studied a number of small organizations, and one of which was it was a day center for older people with dementia or something or similar disturbances, and this was run on a very small scale. And I spent quite a bit of time talking to the woman who ran it. And this is how she said when she first went there, they had a relationship with the local authority social services department, because, you know, they were responsible, they were receiving money, and they also had a responsibility for the welfare of the people receiving the service. So in those days, the social worker involved would arrive unexpectedly and would come and sit in the room where the people, the users of the service were taking part in activities, sit there and watch it and talk to the person running the organisation, and satisfy themselves they thought it was going fairly well. If things weren't going well, they discussed with the organiser how things might be done differently, and so forth. So that was a very benign relationship. But now, the person who comes in doesn't go in that room at all, just comes in the office and checks the numbers. How many people came, you know, each day of the week, last week? Why has it gone down? You know, how we can get it up? And doesn't even bother to see what's going on. So that's a different kind of way in which things are monitored. It's definitely it's a disease of bureaucracy rather than how bureaucracy ought to be. But it's a disease that happens very easily. And I think unless you have non-bureaucratic processes or activities as well, it will go down that road. It's not going to help us very much. See, in the early days, it was compassionate. I mean, it was compassionate. It was also more effective, because if you're just doing the numbers, it's not actually going to tell you very much about what's going on in the relationship with the people who come to attend the centre. But if you're sitting there in the room while it's going on, you should be able to see if it's happening, if things are happening as they should be. So I think it's the wrong, you know, the extremes of definition are the wrong way of monitoring and evaluating what's going on, and that's increasingly the case. So, and as the woman I was talking to said, well, she said, got to the point now, if I'm busy, I don't have time to do clever, so I just make the numbers up. And they look at them and say, that's fine, and they go away. Now, that's ludicrous. So that's the extent to which the bureaucratic mind will take you. I think where it was before it shifted into that bureaucratic decision was, it was very much an ambiguous kind of organization, had elements of bureaucracy in it. You can't organize anything of any size without using some fairly bureaucratic measures. You can't employ staff without giving them a contract of employment, otherwise things go very badly wrong very easily. But I think you can, if the circumstances are right, then the way in which the staff deal with the users can be very different to a bureaucratic model. And I think if you have a healthy mix of people who are not paid staff but volunteers, that can assist things, because if paid staff give you a job description, you go down that way. I don't think volunteers should have job descriptions. That's another issue that comes up. But they will see what needs to happen as they see it, and they will try to make it happen. And in the right kind of organisation, they will talk to the staff, they will talk to the members of the board about how things should be done, and some sort of sensible agreement will be reached about what should be done, what it is safe to be done, and what we can afford to do. And that comes out of something. What comes out of that is a lot more useful, I think, than a pure bureaucratic model. But it's also more difficult to organise, more difficult to run. And I think there have been, in my experience, some very talented people who run that kind of organisation and know when to be flexible, and when flexibility has gone too far, you need to control. And that is that's an art of running this kind of organisation. But you can only do that, you can only have that kind of organisation if you're allowed to. And it all depends where you're going to get the money from to pay for the service. And increasingly, you're either going to get it from the government, who have a habit of getting more and more regimented about what you can do, or sometimes you get money from the market. But then again, you have to deliver what they require you to deliver, because they're selling you something. And once again, you're restricted in that. So what I think that means is that very few voluntary organisations can exist in that ambiguous, helpfully ambiguous state sorry, let's start that again. If that sort of ambiguous state of organisation is to flourish, there's a strict limitation on its size. And one of the issues with bureaucratization is that the larger the organisation, inevitably, the more bureaucratic it has to become. So I think that also suggests that what we expect voluntary organisations to do would be something which is capable of being done on a small scale. So if you are really trying to deal with a large number of people with problems, then it's almost inevitable that there's going to be a greater degree of bureaucracy in organising it. I think it's possible. I think it's a good way to go, but I'm not sure. Yeah, but I don't think there are not very many examples of how that's worked. And a lot of organisations which had this sort of informal arrangements between bits of it have tended to become bureaucratized, so that larger scale organisations like the Alzheimer's Disease Society, the Red Cross and others like that had local branches which had a great degree of autonomy. Now, increasingly, that autonomy has been whittled down, and they've become units of a bureaucracy rather than organisations in their own right, who are sharing in the wider work of the organisation as a whole. So I think this is, it can be done, but there are lots of pressures pushing it the other way. I think there are very few social needs that can only be tackled by using one of those three sets of institutions, and I think, and it's really trying to get the three of them into some sort of reasonable set of arrangements, I think. But I think one of the key things about voluntary organisations and need is that traditionally voluntary organisations have not only tried to meet need, they have tried to persuade the state that the state should take its share of meeting the need. So, for example, the very effective, there has been a very effective group of single parents, and which started out largely as groups of people who met together because if you're a single person, then having a babysitter becomes a problem. So if you go to a meeting with others, somebody looks after the kids, and you can take turns to look after the kids, and you can have social conversations with other people, that's clear. That's a clear voluntary sector activity. But it then becomes clear that, when you talk to other people, you find that there are things about being a single parent which are restricting your ability to do what you want to do. And some of those restrictions could be removed if government pulled its finger out. So you then become a kind of pressure group to change the way in which government behaves. And that's how that organisation developed. And that's a reasonable model, I think. So it doesn't stop you actually providing services, but it does also give you an opportunity to say, well, what we can do is very limited. What needs to be done is bigger. We must now ask the state to do that. I think one of the great things about voluntary sector is that it is heterogeneous. So you can't really see one set of relationships. So there's a campaign to get better statutory support for people with disabilities, which led to a fairly effective piece of legislation a while back. But that was achieved. The pressure to achieve it was done by a coalition of voluntary groups, but also by some voluntary groups which weren't part of that coalition. So you had the insiders who were willing to speak to government on the basis that, we have a reasonable understanding that we can talk about how things should be done, and reasonable understanding, you will understand, you'll tell us what the problems are, we'll understand that, between us we'll sort something out. But it's suggested that would not have gone as far as it did if there was another group of organisations who were not part of that cosy arrangement, but were demonstrating outside the Houses of Parliament, writing angry letters to MPs and otherwise rocking the boat. Now, they didn't get what they wanted, but they probably helped the others get more than they expected because of that external. So, I think there needs to be different organisations which are capable of working in some reasonable collaboration with the state, and others which probably are helpful when they do not collaborate, but are actually in conflict. And somehow the mixture of that is what creates progress, or could create progress. I began life in the voluntary sector by working for something called the Workers' Education Association, which was a national federal body of local branches providing adult education classes across the UK. And I worked for them locally and nationally for a total of 10 years. And that gave me some idea about how local associations work and how non-bureaucratic they had to be. To give you an anecdote, about the first time I visited one of my local branches, I was very annoyed and irritated because they wouldn't get to the point, because they'd been on an outing to a local stately home, and they wanted to talk about the outing instead of getting on with the program, as I saw it, of setting up what courses they were going to run next year. It's only looking back that it occurred to me that actually that's what they wanted to do, that's what they should be doing. And if they were going to run an organisation, that is the way to run it, non-bureaucratically, but a way which meant they were all working closely together, convivially. It wasn't how bureaucracies worked, but it was how that kind of organisation worked, held itself together, got on with the job in the end, and did it very well. So that was my early days of thinking about associations. When I joined the national office of this organisation, I then became involved with the National Council of Social Services, it then was, which is the main infrastructure body for the voluntary sector. I then moved and took a job as head of Cambridge House settlement in South London, which is an amazing education for me, because we had just about every kind of organisation you can think of. It was also in 1978, when I went there, the year when the Wolfenden Committee reported on the future of voluntary organisations, which is probably the time when the idea of voluntary sector really became established. So I was sort of plugged into all that. After 10 years of enjoying myself at Cambridge House, I thought it was time I moved on. The only problem was I couldn't think of anywhere I wanted to move to, because it had been such a satisfying kind of organisation to be part of. So this is when I took a master's degree, which was the very first master's degree in the UK specialising in the study of the voluntary sector. And so I was one of the first students on that. And that gave me the confidence to say, right, I'm not going to have a job, I'm going to become a freelance researcher, consultant, dog's body. And before I could really get very far in that career, the people who taught me on that master's grabbed me and brought me into academia. So that's where I went from there. And I was very much influenced by a man called David Billis, who was really the great pioneer of the study of the theory of voluntary organisations and the voluntary sector at that time. I still cling to the view that individuals working within that sort of voluntary sector environment can achieve great things. We had a volunteer working at Cambridge House who was interested in the welfare of people with learning difficulties, and he started a Saturday club, because these kids very rarely got to meet other and brought them together, and just ran a sort of club but on a very small scale. And within about 5 years, he'd built an organisation with 2 or 3 paid members of staff who had organised a whole series of activities for these people, and were developing the next, working on the next stage of housing for people with learning difficulties, or who were no longer being shipped into big institutions. And that one man started all that, collected other people, and on they went. I think it's just a wonderful lesson how that things can happen. And more recently, my partner and I have been doing a study of what happened during the pandemic in England. One of the things that happened in the pandemic, which has not been studied except by us, is that there was a huge shortage of protective personal equipment for NHS staff, care workers, all sorts of people who were at risk because they didn't have proper equipment. The government eventually did something about it, but in the short run, huge numbers of individuals and groups just got together, got their sewing machines out, scrounged some material, made PPE and distributed them. And that's what people can do. And the point about it all was nobody told them to do that. Nobody asked them to do that. They just saw the need and decided to get off their backsides and do something about it. And that seems to me, those 2 things are, for me, the logic of voluntary action and what really matters.